leaving aside the assault on the motion setter for some kind of syllogism in there, 2 splendid opening statements. You've each got 5 minutes to rebut. Just keep it on the good side of 5, Christopher, if you can.
Now, I don't normally need 5 minutes to rebut the resurrection. And I don't know what I'd do with the remainder of my time. I think what I'm going to have to do instead is make, because we've only got 5, is a couple of factual corrections and then a rebuttal on one of Professor Lennox's main, if not his main point. Small correction, Jesus of Nazareth said he came not to bring peace but a sword. And there's every evidence that he and his disciples meant by that what any person would have assumed they were meant to mean from it, take from it. The European university system owes probably as much to Islam in its early formation as to Christianity. It was, after all, through Andalusia and by way of Baghdad that Europe was allowed to rediscover the texts of Aristotle and many other elements of Greek learning that had actually been nearly obliterated by Christianity as profane. But this enormous contribution that was made by Islam goes nowhere towards proving the truth of any Islamic proposition. It just happens to be a fact about the cultural underlay of the continent, as is the unarguable fact that Christianity was something that everyone had to have an attitude to. After all, until very recently, practically in living memory, you couldn't be the holder of any post at Oxford or Cambridge University unless you were in holy orders. So I'm not going to deny that Christianity had a big influence on our university system. One of the people who opposed that, by the way, was Isaac Newton, who said you couldn't be and shouldn't be allowed to be a Catholic, who said that the doctrine of the Trinity was absolute nonsense, who thought that the only real source of knowledge would be if we could discover what the real proportions of Solomon's temple had been, and could work out a great deal more from that if we could do it than from mere studies of gravitation. I'm just going to the point about religious beliefs as held by men of science. You might have added that Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen, believed in the phlogiston theory, that Alfred Russel Wallace, who did a great deal of Darwin's work for him, certainly his greatest collaborator, was never happier than when going to spiritualist seances. The amount of superstition and extraordinary crackpot belief evidenced by supposed men of science has always been a very great source of wonder. It doesn't prove any point. It's just very interesting to observe. I would say myself that not until Albert Einstein do you get a marriage of science and, so to say, pure mind. And Einstein bases himself on the very familiar propositions, essentially of Spinoza, a form of pantheism, barely even definable as deism, and certainly not as any kind of theism. And we're fortunate to have had a very long letter, you've probably read about it, by him, written in German to a scientist friend in the 1930s, making absolutely clear his complete contempt for all forms of religious belief or the idea that there is a personal God or an intervening deity or anything of that category or description. These are just by way of slight clean-up points on some of the wilder assertions made.
Just up quite a bit of your time, so
I know. What I'm going to be quick about is this, is the concept of a secular totalitarianism. I have a couple of points to make. First is that religion is totalitarian in itself and in principle. It tells you that you are subject, or should be, or would be better if you were, subject to a constant round-the-clock surveillance and supervision and invigilation that goes on while you're asleep, it starts before you're born, and most importantly of all, goes on after you are dead, and that can convict you, this big brother system, of thought crime. Again, even while you're asleep, or having a thought you didn't even know you were going to have, and that will lead to eternal damnation. That's a totalitarian principle from which there is no appeal. It's an unalterable system of power and domination. I'm very relieved to be able to tell you that there's no evidence at all for believing there's any truth to it. But those who say they believe it are recommending to you a totalitarian solution. If Joseph Stalin, looking at what Russia had been like for the preceding few centuries, had not noticed that the principle of rule was that the head of the government was also the head of the church. The Tsar, not exactly divine, was a little more than human, was known as the Holy Father. The Little Father was a bit more than just a king. That he'd been given, communism had been given, an enormous reservoir of servility and credulity on which to draw, gifted to it by these generations of Russian Orthodox totalitarianism. if Stalin hadn't noticed this huge advantage conferred on him, he shouldn't have really been in the dictatorship business at all. And of course, what happens? Well, the first is an inquisition, show trials where the defendants cannot possibly be guilty enough, certainly can't be innocent, but have to keep on confessing to more and more crazy heresies. The worship of an all-powerful leader from whom all blessings flow. The provision of miracles in the form of Lysenko's biology that proposed 10-pound tomatoes and half hundredweight potatoes and 3 harvests a year and other kinds of madness and nonsense to keep the faithful alive. The constant invocation of the devil, always ready to trap the unwary and to lead them from the path of righteousness. You can see it all. You can see it even more classically in the case of today's North Korea, the most perfectly totalitarian state in the world, the most self-sealingly Orwellian in the world, where when President Bush writes to Kim Jong-il, he has to call him dear Mr. Chairman because he's not Mr. President. He's only the head of the party of North Korea and the army. The presidency is held by his father, Kim Il-sung, who's been dead for 15 years. So North Korea, you might say, is a mausolocracy, or a necrocracy, or a thanatocracy. Anyway, it's one short of a trinity. That's the thing I'm drawing your attention to. Now, for this test to be safe, for it to be fair, for it to be objective, this test of secularism and its relationship to the totalitarian, this will be my closing sentence. The following thing would have to happen. You'd have to compare like with like. In other words, you couldn't compare one bunch of faith-based communist thugs taking power in a country that had already been reduced to beggary by theocracy. You'd have to take a country that adopted the teachings of David Hume, Baruch Spinoza, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Bertrand Russell, and decide that these were the values, that these were the principles of separation and secularism by which it was going to live. Then you'd have to show that this society, because of adopting those thinkers, had fallen into famine and slavery and beggary and serfdom and torture and backwardness. And I don't think you'd be able to run that test with any expectation of it turning out that way. But then I don't see how you could have listened to 10 seconds for someone who talks of people who bore great names like that and regards them as princes of injustice and cruelty, and reminds us, in other words, of precisely the kind of religious backwardness from which we've so painfully had to escape. Thank you.
Thank you. You can have the same time.
I think this could be the start of a very interesting conversation. Jesus didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. That's absolutely right. And the sword was a division in those who were prepared to accept him and trust him, and those who would reject him. The fact that he didn't mean a physical sword is perfectly clear from the occasion when his disciples took swords to defend him. And he said, "Put your swords away. People that live by the sword will perish by the sword." He didn't resist arrest. Pilate knew that. And the turning point in the conversation with Pilate, because Pilate was extremely concerned, was this a political revolutionary, a man of violence? And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world, either because if it were, my servants would have been fighting." And Pilate publicly exonerated him from the charge. So it seems to me that it's very clear what Jesus meant by that. Secondly, I take your point completely about the transmission of Aristotle and so on through the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a place that interests me greatly. Islam, of course, I do notice is a monotheistic religion, and nothing in that nuance, and I accept it, alters the point that I was making. But to come to your third point, you mentioned the sort of wacky beliefs that some scientists had, like Newton and Russell Wallace and so on. I'm not talking about wacky beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking about a very serious intellectual thesis. And that is, what is it caused science to explode in the 16th and 17th centuries? It's often called Whitehead's thesis. Men became scientific because they expected law of nature, and they expected law of nature because they believed in the lawgiver. And Joseph Needham, who was a Marxist, wondered why science did not explode in China. There was a lot of technology. And he said the problem was this, They didn't have the notion of a rational creator so that science could be done by rational human beings. I'm not talking about this wackiness, and we need to distinguish. All of us can have some very wacky ideas. I'm talking about a central thesis that comes out of the perfectly comprehensible biblical doctrine that there is a creator. You see, in this contemporary world, we have brilliant people like Jim Watson and Francis Collins. Jim Watson directed the Human Genome Project. He's an atheist. Francis Collins has just stepped down from directing it. He is a Christian. They are men of undoubted highest scientific qualifications, but the things that they disagree on are not science, either in high science or its wacky points. The thing that's at stake here in this whole debate is the differentiation between worldviews. Jim Watson is an atheist. Francis Collins is a Christian. And the problem is we've so distorted this debate, ladies and gentlemen, that we feel that it's a debate science versus religion. It isn't that at all. That's clearly so because you see scientists on both sides. The real debate is between atheism and theism, and we need to distinguish those two carefully. Now, the idea of God as a bully, and in reading your book, I found myself really quite sad in the sense that I can understand that if people have had a very negative experience of God, they can sense that God watching them and overseeing them and so on is a very dangerous thing and a very terrifying thing. But you see, it depends on what side of the fence you're on. The people that perished in the gas chambers, the notion of God watching over them would be a very precious thing. You see, I could describe marriage, ladies and gentlemen, as a terrible thing. There's a woman in my house and she watches all that I do and she sees everything and so on. And I could write off marriage for that reason. You see, the trouble is God watching over us has two sides. Firstly, the care and attention, which is foundational to me in my life and in my family life. Secondly, the fact that there's a God watching means there's going to be justice. Because Stalin, whatever the complicated mixture of religion and power politics was in his heart, the one thing, as David Berlinski, a mathematician and an agnostic Jew, pointed out in his recent book, is this: neither Hitler, Stalin, or Pol Pot, or any of the others, thought that God was watching them. I wish they had.
Thank you.